Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Yes, the drama continues in Ottawa. Will the government fall? Will Justin Trudeau resign? Meanwhile, will the Conservatives continue to solidify their hold on the voter? And what is driving that? If Canada is really broken, does everybody really believe Pierre Poilievre can fix it? So we are going to one of the great young conservative thinkers in the country, Sean Speer. He was previously a senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Harper. I think he was 12 at the time. And now he is the editor-at-large at The Hub, a news and commentary website. No government funding for that website, so you should take a listen if you haven't. Sean, welcome.
Oh, thanks, Senator. I'm always grateful to join you, and I'm especially grateful today. There's certainly a lot to talk about.
Oh boy, the agenda. I do want to start before we get into the meat and potatoes of the state of play in Canada. Is this week, of course, marks the first year since of October 7th, the
Yes.
horrific events perpetrated by Hamas. I read a phrase yesterday that I found really powerful, that it represented a total derailment from civilization.
Yeah.
The crimes were so horrific. I thought that was really captured it. The chants we're hearing now are no longer just from the river to the sea, wipe Israel off the map, but now we don't want two states. We want to go back to 48. This is on Canadian streets. This is with Palestinian flags waving. Where are we on this?
I wish I had a good answer, Senator. I've had a hard time, as so many others have had over the past year, to make sense of all this.
Yeah.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre gave a speech last night in Ottawa to members of the Jewish community, in which he observed that this is not the first war that Israel has fought against its enemies in the region, and yet we've not seen the types of reactions that we've seen on Canadian streets in 2014 or 2008 or 2007 or 2006. So what's different this time? I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to that question, but I think we have to ask it, because it's in some ways, Senator, it's not just merely about this question. It goes to the heart of the Canadian project. We've made a set of choices across successive governments that immigration is going to be at the center of the future of Canada. It's responsible right now for something north of 97% of population growth. And of course, the pool of immigrants from which we're drawing are from all around the world. We are baking into the country's DNA diversity, heterogeneity, and a kind of multiplicity of views about geopolitics, about the good life, and about virtually everything else. And so we've committed to diversity, and by committing to diversity, we've committed to pluralism. And I don't know about you, but over the past 12 months, I've experienced something of a kind of crisis, because it's hard to say over even just in the past 24 or 48 hours that Canadian pluralism is working.
Yeah, I think Mr. Poilievre was sort of suggesting that what might be different is the messaging from the top, right? That if you don't have a clear, emphatic kind of position on Israel as ally, and if you embrace all of these, well, it's nothing short of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's in my mind, it's hate rhetoric about which we have laws. But we haven't seen a reaction to it. There was hardly anything at the beginning in terms of even the police being called in to manage this. There's a little bit more presence now.
I know that was the intimation of Poilievre's line of argument.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that that's a necessary but insufficient explanation for what's happened.
Yeah.
I have a somewhat more limited view about the kind of role of political leadership and the extent to which the population is responsive to political figures. There's something else going on, Senator. We have this kind of weird dynamic of people from different parts of the world who are effectively bringing their prejudices and and their attachment to these kind of old world
Wars. Yep.
conflicts on
Yep.
one hand, and we yet we see that the second part of the story is just as important. There is a subset of Canadian-born population, in some cases, people completely divorced
Yep.
from these different parts of the world, who, through some kind of ideological project, have come to see themselves as on the front lines of an ideological contest between settlers and colonialists
Yeah.
and all the rest. I guess, just to put it really bluntly, it's almost as if we've married kind of left-wing ideas about decolonialization and Islamicist views about Jews and the Middle East, and it's created this really ugly, toxic combination that's manifested itself across the country over the
Yeah.
past 12 months.
And the notion that we always embrace the victim, regardless of who the victim is, or somebody has to be the victim in any,
Yes.
it just is puzzling to me why we wouldn't be seeing the 1,200 Israeli, American, and Canadian families as the victims in this
Yes.
one.
Yes. And
But
I just say, Senator, like, reasonable people can agree or disagree about Israeli politics. Reasonable
yeah,
people can agree or disagree about the Israeli government's prosecution of the war, of its response to these attacks. But I just cannot empathize with people who, on October 7th, the anniversary of this horrific massacre, for which there is no dispute. I mean, we have bloody videos of the
yeah,
terrorists wearing GoPro cameras documenting their murder and mayhem. How someone on a day like that can hit the streets of Toronto or Montreal or elsewhere and champion the terrorists and their acts. We can agree or disagree about tax rates. We can agree or
yeah,
disagree about the size of government. We can even disagree or disagree about Canadian values to some degree, but there's no room for dialogue with people like this, and that's why I say I'm going through something of a kind of a
yeah.
crisis of conscience when it comes to Canadian pluralism.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are, because this is, there is no equivalency here. There is no, on the one hand, on the other, as you say,
Yes.
this is clear cut, and we have all seen the video and the outcome. You, in your comments about pluralism and the impact, I mean, we've already seen the consensus on immigration in this country breaking down just because of the sheer numbers.
Yes.
3 million more people in the last few years, which is the number we would bring in a decade.
Yes.
So you bring them in 3 years, and then surprise, we have a crisis in housing and healthcare and education and you name it. What was the thinking on that, or was there simply not thinking on that to jack these numbers? Again, the easy one is, well, they were trying to import votes and this and that, but it seems that it would have to be more than that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Not only has there been the increase in the absolute numbers, as you say, we've experienced population growth so far this decade that would match decade-long population
Yeah.
growth in the past. In the past couple of years, our population growth has not matched our G7 peers. It's matched developing countries like Chad and Mali and others. It really is unprecedented. But in addition to all of that, one of the striking numbers that I've seen just in the past couple of weeks, Senator, is that we've seen the share of non-permanent residents or temporary migrants grow from something like 1 or 2% of the population to now north of 7%. And the reason I mention that is because I think there was clearly intentionality around increasing the share of permanent residents. The government announces an annual target, and we've seen that
Yeah.
target consistently grow under the Trudeau government, now effectively double where it was during the Harper years. But so much of the growth has happened below the surface through the expansion of non-permanent residents until it sort of exploded in our faces. I think that's the much harder development to fully understand how much of that was intentional, how much of it was formulaic, how much of it was a sort of quid pro quo between the federal government, the provincial government, and the university and colleges to effectively say, we're not going to provide direct public funding to post-secondary institutions. We're going to de facto subsidize them by massively expanding the number of international students who, of course, aren't subjected to the regulated tuition rates.
And we charge them a whole whack more money to. Yeah.
Exactly. I think there's a whole lot going on here. But I'll say this. This is somewhat controversial, but this is you reject nonsense on this podcast. I have, I think, more than just conjecture. I have a semi-informed hypothesis that one of the reasons we've seen these numbers increase over the past several years is that the government was trying to goad the conservatives into opposing high levels of immigration, that they've seen that political strategy play out in other Anglo-American countries, and they thought if they turned the dial enough, at some point the conservatives would say something and they could characterize them as xenophobic and racist and so on.
Yeah.
Many of the similar arguments we saw in the context of the 2015 election over Syrian refugees, the conservatives...
And we're watching it unfold stateside in real time. Harris calling Trump,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, the conservatives resisted that temptation, for better or for worse, and we can talk about that. But it's almost as if in the pursuit of this political strategy, liberals did themselves a disservice because it's not conservatives who are challenging them, it's Canadians themselves. Yes, and so I guess that's a very long way of saying there's a bunch of different factors at play, and it's hard to pinpoint, one over the other. But what is indisputable is the net effect of these changes, I think, is done real and possibly lasting harm to what for a long time was a well-earned and well-protected political consensus in Canada that amounted to relatively high levels of public support for relatively high levels of immigration. I fear that is being undone before our eyes.
Well, and it's coming from legitimate long-term immigrants in this country who say we need to do it the right way. The other argument that's made is because, we're always wringing our hands about the productivity crisis, is that to compensate, if you bring in cheap labor, it balances that out a little bit in the short term, but as you say, not in the long term.
Yeah, it's a great point, Senator. Not to get too wonky for your listeners, but economists say that capital and labor, in effect, technology and workers are substitutes for one another. If you don't have enough workers, at some point, companies will have to invest in technology, which in order to overcome the lack of labor. What we've seen, in effect, at a time when we're facing a lack of business investment and low productivity, we've seen the government massively expand the labor supply, creating this disincentive for companies to invest in technology. And we shouldn't be surprised that the net effect is that we have declining GDP per capita at a rate that is virtually unprecedented in modern Canadian history. That
issue, we study it constantly at committees here at the Senate, productivity and what's the answer. And there's been a lot of pushback on this, but we have had so many people simply make the case that Canadians lack the drive, and that the real problem is, the entrepreneurial spirit that we see south of the border and all of that. But that also governments incentivize the wrong behavior. It's all short term. We'll give you a grant to be a startup, but as soon as you make it, you're out of luck. And so you sell your soul to some big company and the intellectual property with it, right? And so we have kind of the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that cultural argument that there is something inherent to the Canadian psyche that preferences, say, stability over dynamism, or security over entrepreneurship. I'm a bit skeptical of those arguments. In a way, it strikes me as policymakers essentially saying, we don't know what to do, so we'll blame the public, as opposed to looking inward at the extent to which we've created the conditions for these types of outcomes to manifest themselves. I concede that I don't have great answers. In the defense of the Trudeau government, Canada's productivity challenges are hardly new in the past decade. They may be more marked, they may be more pronounced, but
Mhm.
you've been
Yeah,
familiar with these issues for a long,
long
long
time.
time.
Yeah.
I think if there is one exciting opportunity represented by a potential Poilievre government, he seems prepared to shake things up. He's
Yeah.
signaled an openness, for instance, to take on foreign ownership restrictions in different parts of the economy that successive governments, for various reasons, have taken a pass on. I think, for instance, of telecommunications
Yeah.
or airlines, possibly even something on the broadcasting file. Those are not panaceas, but those are the types of tools in our toolkit that successive Canadian governments haven't drawn upon. And it strikes me at this stage, we can't afford to leave any tool unused, given the economic challenges that we're facing.
When you look at the recent announcement of loans to Telesat and you go, but Elon Musk is already doing this. Like, why are we, reinventing the wheel here? We need to be more open at the same time as governments are. And I think spooked by the pandemic when we realized we'd lost our capacity to
Yeah,
respond to issues. So we want
yeah,
to reshore jobs and bring industry back, but we can't do everything. So there's
yes.
going to have to be some
Just
continue.
a brilliant insight. Something I think about a lot. Because I worry a bit the direction we're heading on this front, Senator.
Yeah.
Like, I think if you were talking to my grandfather in Thunder Bay or your constituents in Saskatchewan, they would say, yes, of course, we shouldn't be buying network infrastructure from Huawei.
Yeah.
That we have a national interest in either the capacity to make that technology at home, or at least be able to acquire it from jurisdictions and companies with whom we have a reliable relationship. But I distinguish between technology like that on one hand, and say t-shirts on the other hand. We don't have a
Yes.
national
Right.
interest in a capacity to produce t-shirts. And the truth is, I don't care if we're buying t-shirts from China or
Yeah.
Vietnam or whatever. What worries me, though, is that there is a large swath of industries and technologies in between. And if we don't have a framework to make these judgments in a way that is principle based, that's coherent, you could just see a world where politicians are responding to the loudest voices, and it produces this really erratic and kind of unpredictable set of policy instances where we're intervening to protect this particular sector or technology and not this one, and we're concerned about China here but not there. I think that is a recipe for the kind of devolution into rent seeking and all the rest that conservatives rightly challenge. To be again slightly provocative, I'm a China hawk. I'd put my China hawkishness, up against most people's.
Yeah.
I am not persuaded that electric vehicle production represents a kind of strategic national interest, or to put differently, importing Chinese EVs represents some kind of national security risk that justifies the imposition of tariffs. I could persuade myself of all sorts of Chinese imports that wouldn't meet that kind of national security test. But it's not obvious to me that commercial vehicles do. And you get the sense that the only reason the government is intervening in this case is not because there's some overwhelming national security risk. It's because it's dumped billions of dollars into the sector and now needs to impose tariffs to effectively protect its own spending. It reminds me of Ronald Reagan's famous adage, if a company moves, tax it, if or regulate it rather, if it keeps moving, tax it, and when it
Right.
stops moving, subsidize it. And
Yeah.
that's sort of what we're seeing play out, it seems to me, when it comes to the Trudeau government's industrial policy.
Well, the battery factories where we bring in the South Koreans and we A, give them money, and we B, give them the intellectual property. Like, what is the point
Yes,
of that, right? And
yes.
they're even bringing their own employees over, so it's doubly a problem. I
And
want to,
may I just say something quick,
yeah,
Senator? Because I think this will resonate with you. It also, there's also, I think, for Canadians outside of southwestern Ontario,
Yeah.
not a self-evident case that automobile manufacturing is something that we all have a collective interest in. In addition to coming on your podcast occasionally when you invite me, I host my own podcast. You
I
called
know
me
you
on.
do.
I'm a geriatric millennial. I'm 42, which means that by way of passage, I have to have a podcast. And
Exactly.
I have a forthcoming episode that I just recorded a couple of days ago with a longstanding and really well-respected Calgary-based investor in energy, and he
Yeah.
said, only somewhat in jest, I wonder what our energy policy would be if our natural resources weren't disproportionately concentrated in Alberta and Saskatchewan. They straddled Ontario and Quebec.
You bet.
And I think there's something to that type of rhetorical question.
Every single person that I know in my turf in Saskatchewan, Alberta, believes this. I mean, you are not old enough, but I am old enough to have lived through the NEP days, the National
Yes.
Energy Plan and program, and it has been there, and it's been there since the railways, actually, that we shipped our wheat down here, got processed in Ontario, and then we paid a bazillion dollars for bread. But so that feeling of, don't you know what we're doing? We're seeing that play out and I think it's a false dichotomy, but the environment versus the energy debate.
Yes. Yes.
When you can actually do both, and the people that are leading the environmental change are the industry because they know they
Yes.
have to.
Yes.
Um,
We're
and
recording we're recording today on October 8th. I'm afraid I don't know when the episode will be out, but within a
this
month or so.
afternoon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there
Uh,
you go.
uh, Next month, the environment minister will go to COP. As you no doubt know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of speculation in the industry that we might see before then, or in conjunction with the global conference, the final regulations on the oil and gas emissions cap.
Yeah.
I mean, how else to interpret a policy like that than a government that seems hell-bent on targeting not just Canada's most productive sector, not just Canada's biggest source of exports, but I think, as importantly, Senator, a source of middle-class labor demand that has protected Canada's middle class from the type of job polarization that we've seen in other parts of the advanced world. I mean, this is I think a point really worth emphasizing. It's not just the number of jobs that are at risk; it's the quality of jobs that are at
Yes,
risk.
exactly.
Most other jurisdictions around the advanced world over the past quarter century or longer, Senator, have experienced this exercise in job polarization, whereby the relative share of mid-skilled jobs has fallen, and they have what's sometimes now described as an hourglass economy.
Yeah.
Canada hasn't gone down quite the same path because the energy sector in general and the oil and gas sector in particular has had such extraordinary demand for those types of workers. So not only is there a political economy case for protecting this golden goose, I think you can make the argument there's a sort of socio-political case. One of the reasons we've not seen the rise of disruptive politics and populism and so on is because our energy sector, in a way, has provided really important and valuable and well-paying employment to the types of people who've been on the front lines of populist movements in other parts of the world.
Yeah, that's a really good point because these are good jobs. Young kids from Saskatchewan always went to Alberta to work on the rigs and make good money. But what we've seen morph over the last 25 years is these are
Yes.
now not just high-paying jobs, they're high-tech jobs.
Yes.
And so it's a whole other level of activity,
Yes.
despite from time to time some suggestion from the Prime Minister that, you need to protect the women and children from the people that work in this industry. It's just not true.
Or that we need to be concerned with our resourcefulness, not our resources. If somehow those two objectives or conceptions of the economy are disconnected, to understand our resources is to understand resourcefulness. These are the areas, in fact, where we are global leaders when it comes to innovation and technology. So I guess it's a very long way of saying, as we as we think about the both the political and the economic challenges facing the country, I do think there's an obligation on the part of policymakers to start with the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm,
Yeah, yeah.
and it seems to me that some of the policies that we're seeing advanced when it comes to climate, which you mentioned, it's not just going to do economic harm, as bad as that is. I fear actually it's going to do serious political harm, including to the Confederation.
Yeah, yeah, it fuels separatist sentiment. There's
Yes.
absolutely no question. And Western separatist sentiment, we're busy responding once again to a series of, blackmail demands by the bloc.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, this is going on in Western Canada. The other side about the energy piece is that I think our allies are looking at us.
Yes.
I mean, the
Yes.
Germans asking for LNG in the wake of the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and
Yes.
and and our we still do $2 billion worth of trade every day with the US. Um, we are an energy warehouse superpower,
Yes.
and we should be using that. And when our allies look at us and say, you can't pay your 2% at NATO, like, why not? You've got the
Yes.
most valuable resources in the world.
Yes. Yeah. The that tendency in Canadian elite circles to be somehow insecure and self-conscious about being so-called hewers of wood and drawers of water is
Yeah,
just something I'll never understand.
yeah. It's a good
Providence,
thing, not a bad thing.
precisely, Providence has blessed us with
Yeah,
this abundance of natural resources. Are you kidding me? Do you think Japan wouldn't, or other countries
yeah,
that don't have um, types of natural resources wouldn't kill for them?
yeah, exactly.
It's a kind of fundamental misconception of Canada's economic structure that
Yeah.
in turn I think manifests itself in poor public policy.
I want to get into that issue in a larger way, and because you've written about this and talked about this, kind of what you're witnessing as diminished state capacity. Can
Yeah.
government actually do what it's supposed to do and do what it says it wants to do? Um, I can get into some of the things I see here in the Senate, but we've got a lot of piecemeal strategies when it comes to economics or when it comes to redistributing wealth, and we don't seem to even be doing that very well. So, is that a competence issue or is it an ideological issue?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I know your listeners come from all different walks of life. That's great. I should say uh, transparently, I'm a conservative, which means I
Yeah.
have a narrower conception of the role and size of government. But reasonable people can agree or disagree about these
Yep.
things, right? And I would go so far as to say, and this might be a bit of a bit of anathema to some of your conservative listeners. I think there is a world where the government is probably going to be a bit bigger in the coming years than smaller, in part because of issues like aging demographics. That's just going to impose greater demand on particular programs or particular parts of the government, including our healthcare systems.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see, we're
Wow.
going to
Yeah.
need to see a growth in our defense capacity and our national security capacity. That's bigger government.
Yeah.
And I think you could even argue that as we, move towards a climate agenda that, ought to be the subject of debate, that probably is going to require a more active role for government. So it's a very long way of saying, even as a small government or limited government conservative, I accept the premise that we all have an interest in the government's ability to do what we ask of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I was struck maybe a bit naively over the course of the pandemic that Canadian public administration was not as strong as I took for granted.
Yeah.
I mean, let's put it bluntly. One of the reasons we had longer lockdowns than virtually any of our peer jurisdictions is because our healthcare systems across the provinces collapsed. That is a state capacity issue. our federal government, couldn't purchase vaccines for a long time, which similarly contributed to a longer lockdowns than other
Yeah, we
places.
purchased bad Chinese vaccines and then had to get back in the line. Yeah, sorry about that. Just a
No, no, that's right. And but then it even manifested itself in more pretty basic functions, like we couldn't get bloody passports
yeah,
and this sort of thing. So it's a very, very long way of saying I think that a Poilievre-led government is going to have to pay greater attention than it might be inclined to the basic question of public administration. There's not a lot of votes to be won in
right.
reforming government itself, and so there'll be a resistance to it. But the truth is, I think it's a precondition, Senator, to carrying out some of the bigger changes that a Prime Minister Poilievre would want to see reflected in the economy and elsewhere. I think that there are structural issues within the government of Canada, which represent an impediment to greater state capacity. There is a kind of ideological component to this that shouldn't be underestimated. There's been over the past decade a kind of self-selection into the government, both at the senior levels, but I think even throughout the system of people who've broadly shared the Trudeau government's views about these issues. It's not an accident, for instance, that when he's first elected in 2015, we have foreign affairs officials clapping and cheering. I mean,
Right.
there is a kind of it's discomforting to say, but there is a kind of ideological component here, and so
Yeah.
I think that that boosting state capacity as from a human resource point of view, but also an institutional point of view, will have to be part of a Poilievre-led
Yeah.
policy agenda.
The Liberals made much of the whole deliverology concept that came in, that they were
Yes.
somehow going to take that back from the more traditional conservative view and be the people that delivered more effective and efficient government. But it didn't really work out. So that is going to be a challenge. It just twigs something, because last week when the Conservatives voted for the pension increase as
Yes.
proposed by the Bloc,
Yes.
and of course, that was about politics, forcing the Liberals to vote against it to, prop themselves up. But Poilievre, the Conservatives got a lot of pushback from the base saying, we know you have to play politics to a certain extent, but what are you doing voting for this kind of stuff, which is reckless spending, which most economists have said we don't need. It's not
Yes.
helping a generation that needs it, and it's like $3 billion a year. Like, we can't
Yes.
sustain this.
Yeah, it was a bit of a surprise. As you say, I gather there were parliamentary machinations that may not
Yeah,
be self-evident to us who
yeah,
aren't following these things closely. Um, but I will say this, Senator, that the Canadian Conservative Party has achieved something over the past couple of years that makes it an outlier in the Anglo-American world. Conservative parties historically have overperformed with older voters and underperformed with younger voters. That's sort
yeah,
of axiomatic. And what we've seen under Pierre Poilievre's leadership is the Conservative Party of Canada make unprecedented inroads with these younger voters. The question, of course, is given voting patterns over successive elections, are these people simply telling pollsters that they like the Conservatives, or are they prepared to go out and cast a ballot for them?
yeah.
And
Will they show up? Yeah,
my fear about something like this old age security vote, which you can tell yourself is kind of symbolic and meaningless and part of this parliamentary strategy, is that it's the type of thing that that kind of lowers the intensity of these younger voters, who may not be the difference between the Conservatives winning and losing, but maybe the difference between the Conservatives winning a majority that is capable of doing really big things and a smaller majority that has the effect of lowering its ambitions.
yeah. Well, this is how it's seen, kind of an intergenerational transfer of wealth to the older population. I
Yes.
think Trevor Tom, who was writing for you guys at Hub, said this is the equivalent of a somewhere between a $200 and $400 tax on
Yes.
working Canadians, meaning young Canadians as well,
Yes.
for politics, right? For kind of
Yeah,
feels like.
and that, I think listen, I don't want to sound like a purist. I I worked in government, I worked in politics.
Yep.
I know that there are trade-offs, and I don't want to overstate things. This single vote is not going to um, necessarily fundamentally
No, no.
reshape the political dynamic. But um, I, one of the things that the Trudeau Liberals did in 2015, which was really um, insightful in a way, is that it had a series of policy inducements to make sure that those younger voters weren't just telling pollsters that they liked them, that they were getting out to vote. I think of marijuana
Yeah.
legalization or electoral reform. And I think conservatives, on one hand, need to be thinking: are those types of targeted policies that ensure that these younger voters actually come out and vote? And are there, on the other hand, things like the old age security vote, which cause them to lessen their intensity? I
Yeah.
think you want to minimize that, because, as I say, I think the Poilievre and his team ought to be proud of the progress they've made with these younger voters. It's something I know, for instance, that conservatives in other parts of the world are observing and taking
Yeah.
note of. It really is an enormous political accomplishment.
So that this raises the questions as we talk about, as I said at the beginning, if Canada's broken, then do they believe Pierre Poilievre is the guy to fix it? And what is the evidence of that? Because in campaigns, or until campaigns are official, you don't want to sort of, bear it all. You want to wait until the campaign is underway. But there's increasing pressure to answer the question about, are you going to cut some of these social programs that the Liberals have been spending on that have been popular? Um, are you going to spell out something other, an environmental policy that is beyond axe the tax and
Yes.
that sort of thing? That's going to be the pressure, because there are real differences about how conservatives and liberals in those broad categories deal with issues. Smaller government, bigger
Yes.
government, handout versus hand up. If you're encroaching on provincial jurisdiction, you might want to consult with them, say, for
Yes. Yes.
so that he's starting to get into that tough time.
Yes.
What's the thinking around that?
It's a great question. And I know that, I have reason to believe that these are conversations occurring within conservative politics in real time,
Yeah,
which is to say, how detailed and comprehensive should a conservative policy platform be?
right.
Um, is this about intimating some broad priorities, or is it setting out essentially a blueprint for a Poilievre-led government? There are reasonable arguments on both sides of that debate. I will say this, though: it's something I've been thinking about lately. If you think about it in hindsight, the 2019 election was not really fought over Andrew Scheer's tax proposal
No.
or Justin Trudeau's priorities. In hindsight, what we were deciding, we didn't know it at the time, but what we were deciding is who was going to lead Canada through the pandemic.
Yep.
And so I think if I was advising Poilievre, which I'm not, I would almost encourage him to tell Canadians something is going to land, whatever lands on his desk that we presently can't anticipate. What is the kind of framework? What are the
Yeah.
values or the intuitions that he's going to bring in response to that? In 1983, Brian Mulroney wrote a book that is somewhere behind me called Where I Stand. And
Yeah.
it was a campaign manifesto that, saw, it was a combination of biography and broad policy priorities that tried to give people a sense of what made them tick. In 2024, 2025, you probably wouldn't publish a book. Maybe you
Right.
would make YouTube videos or TikTok
Or
videos or
you'd have a
something like that.
podcast. Yeah.
Precisely. But I think if I was advising Poilievre, I'd almost encourage him to think about it that way. Like, we didn't know we were going to have a pandemic.
Right.
We didn't know that we were going to have October 7th. We didn't know all of these issues. And the truth is, Senator, a platform by definition can't speak to those issues. But what it can speak to is what's the framework that a leader is going to bring to reason through issues, some for which he or she's never thought of before.
Yeah.
I remember when I worked for Harper, I wasn't quite 12, but I was pretty inexperienced. And I remember the first time copyright reform landed on my desk.
Yeah.
How do I think about that?
Exactly.
What set of assumptions do I bring to bear? What's the conservative predisposition to that question? And that was a really tough one, because the truth
it's
is
not like taxes,
yeah. And the truth is that was a really tough one, because on one hand, a conservative could argue you want more stringent copyright because it induces greater investment and innovation, because inventors or companies will know that there'll be a return on their intellectual property. On the other hand, you could make a conservative case that you wanted laxer intellectual property because more stringent IP was a barrier to competition or entry into the market. So I guess that's a long way of saying, rather than a 200-page platform with dozens and dozens of recommendations or commitments, I think in a way what he needs to tell people is what makes him tick. What will he bring to bear when he's confronting issues that we can't even anticipate today?
There's been a couple of books written of late about Mr. Poilievre and the Poilievre effect, as it's called, and some quotes that I noted when I was talking to those authors. Politeness or truth, I choose truth.
Yes.
Compassion is measured in results, not in words or gestures. Saying what I mean and meaning what I say. I mean, he is starting to try and do that a little bit. The response, of course, from the media and the critics and whatnot is he's kind of a glib put-down artist, and pretty harsh and cutting when it comes to the media, which are generally the transmitters of that. So he does need to flesh that out, because there's going to be lots of actual real political problems if he gets there. You never say something is set in politics, but he does need to it's the same debate we're seeing in the US. Who is Kamala Harris, right? You got to put some meat on the bones. Everybody knows who Donald Trump is, for better or worse, right?
Yeah, a good example is because he held mostly domestic policy portfolios in the Harper government, I don't have a good sense of his views with respect to China. Is he he, on one hand, he does have a kind of libertarian dynamic to him. So is he someone predisposed to arguments about free trade and open markets when it comes to globalization? Or is he, in light of what we've learned about China over the past decade or longer, a more circumscribed free trader? It's a good example of an area where we don't need a 10-point plan, but it would be good to know a bit more about him. If I can raise one other issue, though, that I think it's not just the intellectual framework that's going to influence a possible Poilievre-led government. It's also a matter of institutions. I have to ask you, Senator, I've been in Ottawa a lot lately, and the thing you hear in private or over drinks is uncertainty about an incoming Poilievre-led government's relationship with the Senate, given the kind of transformation that we've seen over the past decade. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, you're not putting me on the spot. It's a huge issue, and it's an important issue, and people may, I know the Senate is always the subject of ridicule because it's an appointed body, not an elected one. But every single piece of legislation that any government of any stripe, whether it's majority or minority with allies, puts forward, lands on our desk. We are the sober second thought. We very seldom stop a budget, but we will deal with other legislation. So this is Mr. Poilievre's dilemma. He arrives in Ottawa wanting to undo things and also propose things. And probably what he's going to try and do, because we don't have too many other levers to do this in our system, is propose an omnibus bill, right? Which we see recently. The last Liberal budget was filled with everything but the kitchen sink. And then if he does that, there'll be criticism, obviously, from all sides on approaching it that way. But then there's a halt. Prime Minister Trudeau, underneath under the auspices of the new senator, the old system, it doesn't matter. The Prime Minister of the day appoints all senators, and he
Yes.
has now appointed more than 80 of the 105
Yes.
senators that sit. So you're almost immediately faced with some potential crisis. And then what is Mr. Poilievre's response? Does he decide to take on abolishing the Senate, or try to morph it into triple E, but there's going to be a
So,
crisis,
so,
and
so,
it's going to
so,
come early.
Senator, may I just follow up? So there's the obvious arithmetic, which you just outlined, which
Yeah.
is self-evident. We can all do the math. Um, but there's also a qualitative argument that you hear in Ottawa, and I don't, if you don't feel comfortable, I'm not asking you to criticize your colleagues, just maybe share some insight. The argument you hear is because these senators have been appointed through this
Mhm.
so-called independent process, they may have a kind of heightened sense of their role in the system, that they would be less predisposed to the kind of deference that we've historically seen because of the inherent relationship between senators and the prime minister. Is that possibly at play, or do you think it's principally a numbers game?
Look, I think most people who've been appointed under the new system believe that they're independent. I believe that I vote independently.
Of
In
course.
the group that
Yes.
I am in, you will see us vote three different ways when there are only two
Yes.
options, on pieces of legislation. So there is a degree, but Brian Mulroney was also right that you tend to dance with the one that brung you. And
Yes.
I think people do feel that there's some obligation. They're probably predisposed politically anyway, ideologically
Yes.
anyway, and if they're concerned about Polyev, they will also see themselves as the first line of defense
Yes.
against
Yes.
the change. So it's going to be an issue, kind of either way you look at it, right?
Yeah.
Whatever
Yeah.
perspective you come from. So that does need to be an issue that is being wrestled now and thought about, because the first thing you're going to want to do is do a budget and lay out a bit of a throne speech
Yeah.
plan.
If I can just riff off this point, because it's such a fascinating one that I suspect your listeners, I know my listeners would be keen to hear about. One thing that I say sometimes to different groups, Senator, that kind of destabilizes them in a way, is I say that if elected, Pierre Poilievre will be the most experienced conservative prime minister since Sir John A. Macdonald. And the reason, of course, is that so much of Canadian history has been marked by these long interregnums between conservative
Yep,
administrations, such
yep,
that there's virtually no continuity. The incoming prime minister has not been, say, a former member of a cabinet or whatever. I mean, Stephen Harper hadn't been part of a government. Brian
exactly.
Mulroney hadn't been part of a
Yep,
government. Joe Clark, John Diefenbaker, Robert Bennett, R.B. Bennett. You go down the line. Pierre Poilievre, and I think this is a tremendous part of Stephen Harper's legacy, in a way, in creating a party that could consistently compete for national national power. Pierre Poilievre held the largest portfolio in the Harper cabinet, HRSDC. He was
yep,
a member of the
yep.
Priorities and Planning Cabinet Committee, so he saw firsthand the organization and structure and functioning of cabinet government. He will have views about senior public servants, some of with whom he previously
Yep.
worked. And of course, he'll be drawing on a caucus that's comprised of people that either served in that cabinet alongside him or worked in senior staff roles. And so that ought to create the conditions, especially with a large majority mandate and the likely resignation of the leaders of the different parties,
Hmm.
for an incoming government to really hit the ground running in a way that is atypical, because it'll
Yeah,
come with these
I agree with
with
that, and
with this
and
institutional
I've
knowledge.
made that argument or provided that answer to people too that say, well, what does he know about this? Well,
Yes.
actually, it's all he's done is be part of, be an elected member of parliament and then
I,
serve in government. So
I,
it is the
I'm
counterpoint.
Yeah, and I mention all of that, Senator, because you worry a bit that given all of those factors pointing towards a pretty ambitious government,
Hmm.
that it may only reinforce that instinct among some senators to
Yeah,
be the so-called
the
resistance.
resistance.
And
Yeah.
I worry as a kind of institutionalist that sets the stage for something of a crisis.
Yeah, that's the problem because there's an important, albeit fine line between sober second thought and dealing with the legislation to improve it and, catch what those who are busy trying to get elected don't always catch. And that's
Sure.
the benefit of an appointed body is you're not always on the campaign trail that way versus being the resistance or the bulwark against this change. And because we have a new kind of body, we're not sure what the outcome
Exactly.
of that
Exactly.
will be. So I do think there are lots of questions. I mean, look, there are mechanisms for people, the Senate and the House to go back and forth, and if there are different leaders in the other parties, they may want to revert to the old system. Now,
Mm.
Mr. Poilievre's not going to have many appointments to make, let's put it that way, because
Yes.
there won't be that many vacancies, of course. But maybe there'll be a change of thinking if there are different leaders about what the balance has always been in the former structure where liberals and conservatives were the only two groups because New
Yes.
Democrats don't believe in the Senate. And they always were a bit cautious because they knew their turn was coming soon enough.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so, there's always a check and balance. But no, we're headed for interesting times, as they say, right? Because whenever, what is your bet on this? Is there going to be a prorogation? Do you think we're going to have a vote
Well,
sooner or later?
you probably have a better sense than I do. My instinct um, has been that the New Democrats would find a way to avoid
Yeah,
an election, given what we know about the party's finances and its slate of national candidates. But I've heard the same rumors of prorogation that you have. In
yeah,
fact, I've heard that they may be, that we could see something in the near term.
yeah,
I don't have a good sense, but I will say this that um I because I think we both agree that Canada's economy and other big policy issues are moving in the wrong direction. Um, that there will be a need for an incoming poly-led government should he win to hit the ground running as we've been discussing. And so, as much as they're thinking about campaign strategy and
yeah,
all that goes into it, um, they also need to be thinking about transition.
yeah,
Canada is pretty unique. I looked at this not that long ago because of our Westminster model. The average turnaround from an election day to the swearing in of a government in an instance when the incumbent changes
yeah,
is less than 3 weeks.
yeah,
That means that once you've celebrated the win and you
yeah,
show up in Ottawa and start thinking about the construction of the cabinet and the configuration of the cabinet committees and the speech from the throne and mandate letters and your first pieces of priority legislation and so on, there's not a lot of time.
yeah,
There's not a lot of time. And so it goes back in a way to this point that we've been discussing, which is one of the legacies of Stephen Harper is we have a lot of people in conservative circles who've
yeah, that are,
done this type of thing.
yeah,
When Harper was elected prime minister, uh, we just had been out of power for so long that there wasn't a lot of people to draw on that
yeah,
had direct and
no farm
immediate
team.
experience. One of the members of the transition team, someone for whom I have just tremendous respect, in part because he happens to also be from Thunder Bay, is Derek Burney.
Yeah,
God love Derek. He did a tremendous job and he's a great Canadian, but he had served in the prime minister's office pre-internet.
yes,
Um, There were just inherent limits on
Yeah.
what that transition team could do
Yeah.
in preparing an incoming government for what it is to be a government in the 21st century. So that's a very long way of saying, and I have reason to think that Poilievre is cognizant of this, because he's such a kind of disciplined guy, is that, yes, prosecute the case against the government, get yourself elected, but recognize that the time to prepare for an incoming government is
Yeah.
going to be short,
And you need to
and
be
you're
ready.
really going to have to be moving. Exactly.
Yeah. We're going to talk about this very soon, whenever we figure out what they're doing, maybe a prorogation call in November, or maybe, a vote on a matter of confidence in February. Who knows? But I'm going to call you back and we're going to pick up where we left off right here
I'd
and carry
welcome that.
on. Deal?
Deal. I'd welcome that very much. Thank you so much for
Okay.
having me.
Just great. I always love our conversations, and so do other people. I get a lot of feedback when we have these
100%.
conversations, so I'm glad about that. So Sean Speer, the 12-year-old conservative thinker. No, I'm just kidding. You know that. The editor at large at the Hub, and of course he's affiliated with the Monk School and Macdonald Laurier Institute. But really, an extremely prolific writer. So you should find his stuff and read it. It's great. Thanks a lot, Sean.
Thanks again.
Sean Speer. And thank all of you for sticking with us through this conversation. We'll talk again very soon.